has put them down and apologise if your question hasn't been picked. To start off, we're starting with Susan Croft's question: why are people not rioting about the current economic and social state of affairs?
Right, we're right. So strangely, last time I was in question time, this was exactly the same question that came up. Right, it's a brilliant question because it's sort of, in a way, it gets to the whole problem that we're at. People who are sick of the injustice and the inequality that seems so evident and so manifest and just so just all-encompassing. And there's surely, you can't help things, but I remember when I was sort of 18 and the first time you sort of can't think these things through, you think, surely if I just explain to people, then everyone will see and then they will come along with me and they will riot. That's obvious. And occasionally those thoughts return. You know, they returned to me yesterday when there was this, it just seems so utterly, obviously outrageous and unjust that there can be a so-called democracy where it is suggested that it is a marvellous thing for the government to have 100 people signing this bloody letter on the front page of one of their own newspapers saying, look, these people are supporting the government and they don't want Labour. So almost sort of saying, and these are the people that matter. So really, these are the only people who should have a vote. I don't know why anybody else has a vote unless they're worth £50 million. It's this disgusting thing. And this is honestly true. I thought I was writing a column about it yesterday. I thought, well, I haven't really got the time or wherewithal to go through all 100, but I bet if you go through all 100, you'll find that one or two of them have got all sorts of dodgy tax dodging connections. But I haven't got time or the ability to do that. But I will look up the very first one, just on the off chance. His name was Anand. So, because it was in alphabetical order, it was him. And I looked him up, and within 2 minutes I discovered he was the Chief Executive Officer of Green King Breweries, who last year, Her Majesty's Revenue, whatever HMRC stands for, discovered had swiped £300 million out of his own company in an internal loan in what the HMRC themselves described as making £300 million vanish into thin air so he didn't have to pay tax on it. I thought, at least give me some sport and not have it the first one. At least make it at night and give me a proper. These disgraceful, despicable people, instead of saying we are terribly embarrassed that these people support our government, they go, look at these filthy, despicable, horrible, irredeemable fucking vermin. How can you vote for a government for any party that isn't followed by these tax-dodging swindlers? And so, as you can tell, there was, luckily, I have a newspaper column, otherwise I will be currently detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. That's exactly what the questioner suggests. And this rage cannot escape you, but people don't. Not everybody does. And there are a number of reasons, I suspect. And one of the things is, I think, is that, and I think that the left, whatever you call it, people who support all the opposition to this injustice and inequality and outrage, then you have to be honest about the fact that when people are beaten, when people do stand up and they're beaten and they don't get their way and the injustice continues and the Etonian bloody pigs carry on as they do, then it doesn't make people feel more outraged and more like rioting. It makes them feel less like doing it. It makes them feel like there's nothing you can do. It makes people feel that you might as well just look after yourself because they'll always get away with it. And for a long period of time, this hasn't been exclusively the case because there's been loads of marvellous victories that our side has fought, and I believe, crucially, even when our side fights and doesn't win, then that has an effect that you might not see. I think, for example, that the fact there was a huge anti-war movement against the Iraq War, clearly it didn't stop the Iraq War, but it did mean that the powers that should not be around the world do have to think every time, blimey, we've got to look out for that next time as well. And so it has an effect. But 1 million people went on the march, and a great many drew the conclusion there's not really anything you can do. We all stand up, there's nothing you can do. A few victories, that's what we need. It's been the case for a long time. There are little ones here and there. A few victories, a few things that say, just because you own and control the world doesn't mean you always get your way. And you can see it, and I think there'll be some examples tonight. You can see people become different people. The people who are down, who stoop and think there's nothing you can do, suddenly become people who think, I am part of the force that can change the world. It only takes a few, and I hope this is part of creating those few.
Thanks. We can always organise one now, so that's probably a sign, isn't it? I get arrested now, doesn't that just get dragged off by the local constabulary? That'd be a bleak end to the evening. No, look, people are rioting, and it's important Mark made that point about people fighting back, and talking about victories, talking about successes, and this is why. The defenders of all injustice, they want us to believe that injustice is a bit like the weather. You can complain about it raining, but there's nothing you can do about it. It's just the way the world is. Tony Benn died last year, and I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room to miss him very much. And he said that when you get change, is the burning flame of anger at injustice, and the burning flame of hope at a better world. Well, there's so much anger out there, and so much fear, but one thing missing, and that's hope. And without hope, people become resigned. They join the biggest party in the country, which isn't Labour or the Tories, certainly not the Lib Dems, it's the yelling at the TV party. All the anger is turned on their neighbours, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later on tonight. But otherwise they give up, and that's why we've got to talk about successes. I think of the students back in 2010, and they had the trebling of tuition fees, the snatching away of the educational maintenance allowance, which summed up a government of millionaires slamming the door in the faces of working class young people across this country. And it was said that, we weren't like the hot-headed French and Greeks that people don't take to the streets in this country, and young people were patronised as the apathetic X-Factor generation, but when they had the temerity to actually get politically engaged on their own terms, what happened? Well, they were met with police batons and kettles in freezing temperatures, but they gave hope to other people. Those were the biggest student demonstrations since the 1960s. I think of the strikes of 2011, November 2011, that was the biggest strike since the general strike of 1926. I think of UK Uncut, predominantly young activists amongst others, including in this great city, who occupied shops and businesses whose owners were avoiding tax on an industrial scale whilst we're constantly told that our services have to be slashed, the social security stripped away because there's not enough money to go around, and they drove the issue of tax avoidance on the agenda. I think of those who fought against the bedroom tax, one of the most cruel and unjust policies a government's inflicted on its own people, forcing predominantly poor disabled people to cough up money they don't have or downsize to smaller properties that don't exist. People took to the streets, they organised, including those affected, and they forced Labour to commit to repealing that disgraceful act if they were elected as the next government. I think of the electricians who took on Balfour Beatty, a great multinational company, after their terms and conditions and wages were attacked, and they went on strike and they occupied and they won. I think of the cinema workers in South London, Brixton Cinema, Ritzy Cinema, who fought for the basic principle that everyone in work should have a wage on which they can live. And they won despite these huge threats and attacks on them, a massive increase in their wages. The same occurs on cinema as well. Why do I say this? Because it's the case that actually injustice isn't like the weather. The politics of hope says all injustice is temporary, it's transient, and it can be overcome if people have enough determination, enough courage, and enough commitment. And that's what our ancestors tell us. That's the history of this country. So yeah, this is a tough time, and lots of people out there feel resigned, and their anger is turned on immigrants and unemployed people and public sector workers, rather than the bankers who plunged this country into economic disaster, the tax dodgers, the poverty-paying bosses, those really responsible for the mess that we're in. But there are people fighting back, and the more we celebrate those victories and those successes, the more we embolden other people to fight back as well. So let's leave, and the number one principle tonight, as every meeting like this, is this. we leave more hopeful than when we entered the room in the first place. We can organise, we can fight back, we can overcome injustice. We're taking a bit of a scenic route at the moment, I'll give you that, but we will overcome. We will overcome, and we will build a society run not as a racket for the mean and the greedy, but a society run in the interests of the real wealth creators, working people.
Other groups don't share our aspirations or our values, and we need to come together more. I was home last night with my co-author Richard Wilkinson, and we were watching a film. We don't get out much, and we're always rather behind the cultural curve. We don't go to the cinema much because it's too loud. I'm feeling a bit like I'm in the cinema this evening. But last night we finally caught up with the movie Pride. And I'm sure we're probably the last people in this entire room to have seen it, but if anyone else is lagging behind, it's about how the lesbian and gay community of London, fighting for gay rights, came together to raise money and support the miners' strike in the early 1980s. And it is moving as well as extremely funny. We were in floods of tears. It was about solidarity, and it was about how groups who are equally oppressed, fighting against the powers that be, can come together even if they start out very, very far apart. And watching it, I felt a huge sort of wave of nostalgia for that kind of solidarity, and that isn't something we should be feeling nostalgic about. It's something we should be actively creating every day that we can. Because too often we're being set one against each other, neighbour against neighbour. And when people try to demonise immigrants, or the unemployed, or the mentally ill, we all need to be standing up and saying, no, we are that tribe as well. We're all one tribe.
If we actually look back just a few years ago, people did actually riot. And I think although the government and the mainstream, they tried to depoliticise those events that took place, but actually I think that was an expression of a disaffected youth, people who were very, very angry with the system, people who were very, very angry with everything that was going on, the way that they were being treated, and there was riots that took place actually, you know. Now, I suppose the question really is how we can focus that anger into something that's progressive, that's positive, and in a way that actually has a serious impact on society. And I think the biggest hurdle that we've got to overcome really is it's not about how do we win the arguments, the big arguments. On the whole, I think we've won the arguments around privatisation, we've won the arguments around the NHS, around austerity in lots of different ways. You know, all of these kind of big questions. I think there's a general sense of radicalisation across society. I think the biggest hurdle that we face is that convincing people that if you fight back, you can win. And I think that's something that we all need to think about how we overcome. Because if you look back at any real progressive change that's taken place in society, it's always been a mass movement that has been behind it, whether that's the right to vote, the suffragette movement, the Chartist movement, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the civil rights movement in America, you know, the student movement in Quebec, you know, I mean, you can go on and on and on. Any serious progressive change has come about from a mass movement. But the ruling class, the rulers, if you like, the mainstream will never say that, oh, we didn't do this because of your demonstrations on the streets. We did, or, you know, we didn't do this because of you guys were protesting around that. The anti-war movement is a very good example, actually. You know, we didn't manage to stop the war, but actually in 2003, but Tony Blair left early. The government lost the vote on going to war in Syria last year, and now I think those were testament to the work of the anti-war movement over the last 13 years or over a decade, and I think we've got to remember that. So I think going forwards we need to obviously hold more, have more meetings like this and more things like this, but also convince people that collective action can seriously change things at the same time as boosting our own victories. And I think that also means rebuilding the trade union movement in this country, because they're constantly under attack. It's been since Thatcher, really, decades and decades of the trade unions being hammered hard. But we need to start to rebuild that, and I think meetings like this will go. I hope people will feel confident to go back to their workplace, take action in their workplace, and take their whole thing forwards. And that's really how I think we can change things, is by building a serious mass movement around the big political questions.
Runs through what everyone else has been saying, that if you're angry on your own, you're not really likely to do anything unless you're some mad person that goes down the street shouting and having everyone sort of wondering what's up with you. You need to feel that other people are going to join you. And I just want to talk a little bit about the experience of the Freedom Riders in terms of that, because the reason why the Freedom Riders has been such a large movement is because we managed to draw people together. The way we did that, there were 5 of us spent a whole week just leafleting the bus station and the train station in Barnsley to organise a meeting to protest against the cuts that were taking place in our travel pass concessions. And the result of that was we had a meeting of 300 people in the library. The caretaker had to start turning people away on health and safety grounds. And that large number of people coming together, and I have to say most of them are people that wouldn't dream of coming to a meeting like this. Some of them are people with an NUM background, some of them women against pit closures, but a lot of them are people that have never been involved in anything they describe as politics or protest in their life before. They just suddenly felt that something was unjust. They came together with lots of other people and they felt they could do something. And so we took on Northern Rail and the British Transport Police, and people felt, because we were discussing every week about how we carried on the campaign, there was a real democracy, people felt they were involved in it, because I think this is very important as well, that whatever movement takes place, everyone that's in it must feel that they have their ideas listened to, they contribute to things, and that gives you even greater power. And so when we had the incident in June last year, when myself and my colleague were arrested quite brutally by the British Transport Police, I think Northern Rail felt that that was going to be an end of it. We're talking about people in their 60s, 70s and 80s seeing sort of a really nasty punch-up on Sheffield Station. And it didn't make people disillusioned, because we built up that idea of people coming together, discussing things each week. It actually put some backbone into people even more, and they said, no, we're not going to go away. So I think that theme of confidence is really important. I think the other thing we have to say is that we need to look forward. You know, in all of our minds is May the 7th, and there's obviously going to be some sort of political change there. But actually, I don't think that political change is going to be that significant. I don't think that whichever government comes in on May the 7th is suddenly going to turn around to pensioners in South Yorkshire and say, you can have all the money you're asking for your travel arrangements to come back. And I think the fight will carry on. And what we've got to do is to say to people in trade unions, many of whose leaderships in those trade unions have said, wait for the election, let's see if Labour get in and make things better. Well, it didn't make things an awful lot better in 1997, did it? And I think the way we're leading into the election in May, we don't have much to hope from for any government that comes in. We need to be prepared to go out, whatever the government is, fight back and say, no, we're not going to see people suffer more from austerity.